Putin is severely rattled. I think he's holding on. I think the hawks are gathering in Moscow. And, it's one of those things. It just needs a bit more of a push.
Obviously, one of the big debates raging at the moment among Ukraine's Western allies is whether to provide Storm Shadow and Scout missiles for use on targets inside Russia. I know this is something that you personally have been wanting to see happen for some time, Hamish. Just explain a bit about why you find it so frustrating that it hasn't been done so far, and what effect they would have if they were approved, and had we approved this months ago, where we might be now.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there is a lot to unpack here. First of all, I think everybody is aware that the West has drip-fed key weaponry into Ukraine. And that has been a real sea anchor for Ukraine to be able to act. First of all, it was tanks, then it was air defense missiles, then it was long-range missiles, and then it was F-16 fighters. And that, again, that is just not a way to win war. You've got to be bold. You've got to read and understand the principles of war that I briefly discussed just now. Now, before I suggest how Storm Shadow might make a difference, why are we in this position? And it's all about escalation. Western leaders have been intimidated by Putin for the last 2.5 years. Virtually since the day of the invasion, 24th of February 2022, Putin and his gangsters, if you like Medvedev and Peskov and others, and Foreign Secretary Lavrov, have threatened us with nuclear attack. And, not unsurprisingly, Western leaders, particularly in Europe, particularly those who are right up to Ukraine and Russia, have been concerned and cowed by it. But I think myself in particular have been trying to articulate to these people that these threats are just bluff and bluster. And even more so if Ukraine's allowed to use Storm Shadow. And just on the escalation of nuclear, I think there is very little else that Putin can do in escalation. He can send his FSB, Secret Service, to sabotage around Europe, which is happening at the moment. But that extraordinary briefing last week by the head of MI6 and the head of the CIA saying, yeah, the Russians are doing this, we're keeping a really close eye on it. And, I think, the FSB are pretty incompetent. I'm talking to you from Salisbury, which was one of their disastrous missions in this country. So I got the feeling from the briefing from the CIA and the MI6 is they wanted everybody to make aware that the Russians are doing this, but actually, they were onto this particular issue. So when we come on to why Storm Shadow and similar missiles are so important, most of the glide bombs, the strategic missiles, the hypersonic missiles that are attacking the hospitals and schools, but also the power infrastructure, because again, Putin, if you attack the civilians and freeze them to death in the winter, they're gonna. He thinks they capitulate and make the government capitulate. So those are being launched from airfields and sites about 100 miles or so into Russia. At the moment, Ukraine has no ability to stop them. So the only way they can stop them is once they come over the border, if you like, they can try and knock them down with air defense. But that is difficult. That they can be overwhelmed by it. So what Storm Shadow gives you is that sort of 200-mile range, which would cover these bases and other key military command and control centers. Storm Shadow is very accurate, very capable. The Russians seem unable to intercept it. So that would prevent that. Also on the nuclear side, the missiles that fire Russia's tactical nuclear weapons have a range of about 300-400 miles. Therefore, they need to be moved very close to the Ukraine border to attack any, if they want to attack Kharkiv or, if they want to attack Kyiv itself, they'll probably have to move them to Belarus. And there is rumors that there are some tactical nukes there. But it's very clear that, and it sort of links into the Storm Shadow, because one of the issues is that it is UK and US GPS sort of capability that enables Storm Shadow. The inference to that is that the UK and the US have intelligence satellites and others that are looking very closely in this area. So if Russia did decide to move its tactical nukes into a position where they could fire, the Ukrainians could then take them out. I mean, I think NATO, UK, US would probably do that anyway. And I am certain Putin knows that. The last thing that last act he would do would be to try and fire a tactical nuke and have it destroyed on the ground in Russia, which I think is the most likely scenario. So when you put all that together and our discussions on how Kursk has really put the Ukrainians on the front foot, actually that is why Storm Shadow is, it's not the icing on the cake, but it's such a key enabler that would really, I think, force the Russian hand, because I don't think Russia is in any position to do anything, militarily, tactically clever, if you like. All they can do is put people into the meat grinder, and you get the feeling now that Putin is perhaps hoping that if they can have a ceasefire now and negotiate for current borders, then Putin's got everything he wants. But, I think Putin is severely rattled. I think he's holding on. I think the hawks are gathering in Moscow. And, it's one of those things. It just needs a bit more of a push. And that's where Storm Shadow comes in. And I think maybe the new government is showing a little bit of naivety. They are inexperienced. We appreciate that. But they've got to understand, this is much more of a problem to us than the Americans. Biden and his team are sitting 4,000 miles, west, well out of it. They've got an election coming up, and the war in Ukraine, to me, and I'm not a close follower of the US election, is not a huge issue. And of course, if Trump gets in, it could be a huge issue because, he could really make things difficult. But where we're sitting, and we look east and 1,000 miles or so to Ukraine, things are pretty close. Why some of our European allies are, well, I think, the Scandinavians are absolutely all over this, and I'm sure if they had Storm Shadow, they would be going full on. So although this seems like a small decision, I think it could have a strategic impact. And I get the feeling we're at a pivotal moment. And I just hope, that the new occupiers of number 10 and Westminster, realize that. And it slightly frustrates me, and it would do because I'm a soldier. And I quite understand everything else they're trying to do is, David Lammy's talking about climate change being his number one priority today. The Prime Minister is sort of, doing deals with the health service. Everybody's worried about, a whole host of things. But actually, this must be the number one issue because, otherwise, if Ukraine doesn't soon get the peace it requires, we once again could be fighting in Europe. And I hope amongst all the special advisors the Prime Minister, David Lammy and others have, is they have a history advisor to tell them what happened when we let Poland go in 1939, but we could potentially let Ukraine go in 2024. We then spent 6 years fighting the Nazis. And that is the last thing we want to do. I still think it's unlikely, but it's possible. But it gets just a bit more likely the more this war goes on.
And it's interesting how that fear of escalation remains, even though, as you say, Hamish, a lot of people would say Putin's red lines have been exposed as a bluff. And in part, that kind of explains why the West is trying to justify potentially supplying Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine by saying it's in response to Iran providing 200-odd ballistic missiles to Russia. Now, I know something you've picked up on is kind of the quid pro quo that may be involved in those kind of deals.
Absolutely. I think Iran has made a massive strategic mistake by giving those ballistic missiles to Russia. But actually more concern, and information has leaked out. Where it's come from, how credible it is, I don't know. But it seems reasonable. There is a view that in return for Iranian ballistic missiles and North Korean ballistic missiles, the Russians have traded nuclear weapon technology. And to me, that is frightening. We know the Iranians have got missiles. We know the North Koreans have got missiles. We know the Iranians have been enriching uranium for some time and are trying to develop a weapon. Kim Jong-un, tells us he already has several warheads. What the challenge of both countries has been marrying the warhead to the missile. That is the really tricky scientific bit. Now, if the Russians are giving them wherewithal to do that, then that sort of changes the game. So I think it really reinforces, and the only way to nullify this is to enable Ukraine to prevail. Because once Ukraine prevails, Putin is gone, without a shadow of a doubt. Whoever replaces him may well be worse, but they've got no army to threaten NATO. And again, I think, a lot of people who perhaps on the periphery of this saying, NATO is so much more powerful militarily, economically and everything else than Russia. Why are we in this position? We're in this position because, NATO leaders have been timid and have not wanted to flex their muscles because they've been worried about the nuclear piece and about the red lines and escalation. But I think, even the most timid and fearful person must realise that these red lines, as you've said, are complete bluff and bluster. But the Iranian piece and the North Korean piece is something we need to watch very closely. And the best way to nullify it is to ensure that Ukraine gets the peace it wants and Russia returns to whence it came.
Or one other good intelligence reason that, again, for me, the signals intelligence, human intelligence, or technical intelligence, they may actually know that the intent of Putin might be to escalate if this were to be used.
5 former British defence secretaries and the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson told the Sunday Times Britain should let Ukraine use British-made Storm Shadow missiles to strike targets inside Russia, with or without American permission. Is that is that a wise suggestion? Let's talk to Major General Chip Chapman, former senior British Army commander. Hello to you, Chip.
Good afternoon, John.
Welcome, Chip. Give us your take, first of all, on the importance of getting permission for Ukraine to use these British Storm Shadow missiles.
Well, you have to look at what Storm Shadow and ATACMS would do and what it wouldn't do. So what it would do is push back the Russian staging areas and push back their supply depots, therefore making it harder for them to bring combat power to bear in the close battle. What it won't do is impact on the launching of glide bombs and the firing of cruise missiles. US intelligence suggests that 90% of Russian aircraft launch from airfields which are outside the reach of Storm Shadow and ATACMS. So that's what it would do.
So does that mean it would perhaps help in giving protection to Ukrainian towns further away from the border, but not actually on the battlefield close to the border?
Yeah, it would. It'd help prosecute the deep battle to some extent. It makes the tempo of operations slow up because you can't bring the supplies and troops forward in the way that you'd ideally like to do. And although the former defence secretaries and prime ministers may have said just get on with it, there are probably pretty good targeting reasons why the British can't do this. And this is often misunderstood. Yeah. So a Storm Shadow is a precision-guided munition. To use a precision-guided munition, you need to identify a high-value target because these things are £1 million a pop, and that requires surveillance and reconnaissance. That can only really come not from what we would historically call air breathers, planes which fly over it, but from satellites. Yes. And I suspect that given the space power of America, they have something like 5,184 satellites in space, or did as at May 23, that it's only the Americans who have that look-down capability to identify the targets that they might need to hit. Then, because it's a precision-guided munition, you need navigation and guidance, which updates the missile as it's going to its target, and all that requires data links. Somewhere along that, what we call the kill chain, you probably need American capability or authorization or permissions, and somewhere along that kill chain, we probably don't have it. Now, we know from post-2014 that 18 Airborne Corps, American Airborne Corps instructed the Ukrainians in a thing called augmented targeting process when they looked at this kill chain and helped them in terms of what we call C4ISR, that's command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So all that sort of stuff depends on space infrastructure, and somewhere that is missing in the ability of the British to do that. Or one other good intelligence reason that, again, for me, the signals intelligence, human intelligence, or technical intelligence, they may actually know that the intent of Putin might be to escalate if this were to be used. So either for political reasons, technical reasons of the use of it, or intelligence reasons, it's not as simple as people think.
And just nail that down for us. If Britain were to go ahead and give permission to use Storm Shadow missiles without American permission or cooperation, what does it mean? Does that mean that these missiles could simply go astray, be wasted, hit nothing at all in empty areas, or maybe hit the wrong targets?
Well, I just don't think they'd have the targeting data to actually put the program in the data to hit the high-value targets. So it would fail probably at the forward end of looking at what you might find, track, and then target. I just don't think somewhere there's something which is missing in that. Now, of course, there was always a political decision, and 2 weeks ago, the situation seemed to have changed when people were talking once again about equalizing the battlefield, because this was supposed to be in reaction to the Iranian ballistic missiles being given to the Russians. And we know that dark ships, that is those that have their automated information systems turned off, have arrived at ports in Russian ports. So Iranian capability ballistic missiles are on the way. There's been no reciprocity in terms of allowing the Ukrainians to equalize that part of the capability spectrum.
Yeah. Well, so given these important technical obstacles to going ahead with that American cooperation and permission, it's surprising that these former defence secretaries and prime minister are suggesting Britain do exactly that, aren't they? And what about the question of keeping European allies alongside, making sure as far as possible everyone moves along at the same pace?
Well, that would be a great thing to do, but it doesn't always occur, of course. And we saw that with the sort of foreign military sales and third-party transference of, for example, German Leopard 1 and Leopard 2s, where a number of allied countries couldn't just transfer their Leopard 1, Leopard 2 fleets without the permission of Germany. And that was one of the things which was a drag on tanks being given to Ukraine, for example. So it'd be great if you could go in lockstep, but there were always sovereign reasons and other reasons why nations don't.
So is there anything that you would wish to see the British Prime Minister and the British government doing now that they are not doing?
Well, of course, war is too important to be left to the military, and this is always in the realm of politics. So again, can we use these missiles? It'd be great if you could, and it would help Ukraine. Should we and must we? Are political decisions. At the moment, Starmer hasn't convinced the Americans that this needs to be done. He needs to keep on going around that sort of cycle, his own targeting cycle, to try and convince them that this might be a good thing on behalf of Ukraine.
In a nutshell, do you then think that President Biden is just too hesitant?
Someone is in the American polity.
A lot of Russian experts and more amount of them saying that Russia will have to use tactical nuclear weaponry.
Sergei Markov is a Russian political scientist and a close advisor to Vladimir Putin, and he joins us now. Hello.
Hello.
Russia attacked Ukraine, so why should they be upset if Ukraine fights back with all the weapons at its disposal?
It's very easy. First of all, the main reason why Russia attacked Ukraine is to liberate Ukrainian people from clear terroristic, Russophobic and neo-Nazi regime. It's first.
Yeah, well, it's not liberating it, is it? It's bombarding it, killing its citizens.
Liberating them. And your government is lying.
Well, liberating them by killing them.
To lie. But okay, but go ahead and understand. Before this, during these 2 years, Ukrainian army strike Russian army. It's bad things, but it's reasonable. But mostly important that now you want to bomb Russian cities by your rocket missiles and by your satellite group. So you want to target your rocket missiles to the Russian cities to kill our people. Your Great Britain is going to do it. And you think that we will keep silent? Because Ukrainian army has no own satellite group. So it's exactly you are going to target these rocket missiles to Russian cities. And
Russia,
you think that we say,
well,
okay,
hang on.
No.
Russia is getting weapons from Iran. Russia is getting weapons from China,
Yes.
which it is targeting at Ukraine and killing Ukrainian citizens.
No, they're not killing
Ukrainian civilians. So why can't Ukraine retaliate?
Yeah, the difference is very simple. If Russia gets some rocket missiles, which, by the way, Iran deny, but nevertheless, let's imagine that Russia gets some rocket missile from North Korea and from Iran. But we're targeting target ourselves. But Ukrainian army has no satellite group, and that's why it's your Americans and British going to target those rocket missiles to Russian cities. It's directed movement to war. You want to have war? Go ahead.
Well, what would war mean? Does that mean you expect if this attack on Russian territory with the assistance, clearly there is assistance from...
Not assistance.
Well,
not assistance.
yeah.
It's like Ukrainian assist you. It's Ukrainian assist you. And those Ukrainians which you make your proxy army. Because most of the Ukrainians doesn't want to fight, as you may know.
President Putin says that it's effectively a declaration of war. I'm just asking how we would respond. Should we expect that there will be attacks on British territory, for example?
Finally, yes. Finally, of course, it will be attack against British territory. But from the beginning, but it depends also on the Great Britain. But from the beginning, I think the British embassy will be closed. Then the Russian embassy will be closed in Britain. Then some of the British drones and military aviation would be crashed down. And also because these British missiles will be used from F-16, but F-16 based not in Ukraine. They based on the Romania and Poland airfield. Possibly Russian army will have to give a real strike to those F-16, which is on the Romanian and Poland airfields.
And do you see any chance of the use of tactical nuclear weapons by Russia?
Yes, of course, because now a lot of Russian experts and more amount of them saying that Russia will have to use tactical nuclear weaponry, specifically exists first stage possibly against exactly this F-16, because F-16 is part of the nuclear potential of the NATO countries, and it looks like that these British rocket missiles from American F-16 jet will be a target not only against Russian cities, but also a part of the Russian nuclear defense system. If you will hit, if you strike against Russian nuclear defense system, Russia will have to respond.
What do you say to the British politicians we've been speaking to on the programme this morning who say, well, you know, we've heard these threats and saber rattling from President Putin before, and as the support for Ukraine has escalated, actually, there hasn't been any delivery on those threats?
Yes, it's exactly. Vladimir Putin never gave a strong response to escalation. That's why he was very strongly criticized inside country. That what it means. It means that Western countries going endless escalation, but Russia don't give any response. And finally, Western politicians, American and British, come to the conclusion: no, Russia has no red lines. Just hit Russia, hit it, put Russia on the knees. And now people say, look, no. This should be stopped. Mr. Putin says them that it will be their last time. We will give response. It's the difference.
You are confirming, or you've just confirmed, that North Korea has supplied weapons. Where is Russia getting its weapons from? North Korea, Iran, China, is that correct?
It's very small. It's a top secret. I don't know exact details. What I know for sure that 90% of the Ukrainian army weaponry is Western weaponry, and 90% of the Russian weaponry is Russian weaponry. That's why it means that were taking part in those war, but Ukraine is not the side. We believe that we have hybrid war with NATO and first of all, of course, United States and its allies as Britain. So from our point of view, you made Ukrainians your slaves and use your slaves in fight in having war against proxy war against us.
The reality, though, is that neither side appears to be winning this war. Russia thought it would be a matter of days, and here we are more than 2 years later. Do you think really that your country is tiring of this war and is ready to negotiate a settlement?
Yes, of course, Russia ready to negotiate. I think that the position for negotiation appears deal very easily. First of all, democratization of Ukraine. It means all political prisoners in Ukraine, all thousands of political prisoners should be liberated. All dozens of political parties which have been prohibited by Vladimir Zelensky should act free. And all hundreds of the media which have been prohibited by Zelensky also could be free. All political refugees should have the right to come back to Ukrainian territory and take part in the political life. It's first democratization, then denazification. When we're talking about denazification, we're talking not only about taking neo-Nazi from Kiev regime, but first of all, stopping system of terror, which is a major political...
That doesn't sound like a peace settlement. That sounds like a victory which Russia's failed to deliver. I just wonder if, let's assume that there was some territorial exchange, that Russia did take some of the Donetsk provinces, would it ever be acceptable that the rest of Ukraine could be a sovereign country, a member of NATO, and an applicant to the European Union?
Sovereign country and member of NATO, it's contradiction in itself. Because to be member of NATO, it means to give some big part of its sovereignty to the United States of America. It means that we want Ukraine to be independent country. It's meaning that Ukraine should have not only demilitarization, but denatofication. So all NATO representative should leave Ukraine. And Ukraine could be independent like Switzerland. I think Ukrainians would like to be Switzerland.
If just one of these missiles goes wrong and goes into a civilian area or hits a civilian target rather than a military target, what do we expect Russia to do? And then we're into the spectre, perhaps not the actuality, but the spectre of a nuclear confrontation, which nobody wants. I do think Putin is bluffing. He's bluffed on numerous occasions, numerous red lines have been crossed, and he's done very little about it. But at the same time, I'm kind of with Jake Sullivan, actually. I'm kind of with the American line here in terms of saying there's got to be a better way.
Then, this front page story in the Sunday Times. 5 former Conservative Defence Secretaries and Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, of course, seemingly pressuring Sir Keir Starmer to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia. And the kind of point of this, as you'll have heard over the course of breakfast this weekend, is about the US giving approval or not. And the front page story on the Sunday Times today from the aforementioned Defence Secretaries and PM is, who cares? Don't wait for the US, just go for it, Keir Starmer. Joel, what do you think? Is this sensible?
I think it's fairly inevitable. Frankly, I wouldn't pay a blind bit of attention to what Boris Johnson has got to say about anything. And I think Keir Starmer is a naturally cautious, will weigh up all the options. I mean, it is very compelling. I think what is very interesting, actually, and you were talking to him earlier, Mark Urban, who's joined the Sunday Times, hugely respected former diplomatic correspondent for Newsnight on the BBC. And he's got a very long piece about the desire for an end game, which I think is much more interesting, that both Russia and Ukraine are really, they're war weary, they're broke, they're running out of troops, and everybody's waiting to see who will blink first. But of course, in the meantime, you've got China and Iran who are helping Russia with their armaments and weapons. And I think, Starmer is quite right to be cautious. It is very, very tempting to say, yes, go ahead and do it. But he's got to go in tandem with the US. And I think, behind the scenes, I'm quite sure there is pressure on the American government to give the go ahead. I mean, it's such a difficult time, Callum, because within a few weeks, we may have a different president, a different government in America, and that could change everything. So in a way, the pressure is to do something perhaps before Trump gets back in. But on the other hand, if both sides really, really want to come to some sort of end game, some sort of negotiated settlement, then I'm sure there are an awful lot of diplomatic moves going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, I suppose there's a couple of things there. One is that, Kamala Harris might get in, and I suppose Trump would suggest that actually he would be the one to bring the two sides together and to bring a conclusion to this war. I'm also struck, Joe, by what you say about Boris Johnson. You wouldn't listen to him on anything, but Boris Johnson's connection and affection for Ukraine and from Ukraine is actually quite well known.
Yes, it is. But he was right to do what he did, and he was really up there and up front supporting Zelensky and supporting Ukraine. But if you look back at any part of his checkered career as foreign secretary, he managed to screw up quite spectacularly on quite a lot of things, and he's not known for detail. He is known very much for gestures. And I think one has to be very careful. There's an awful lot of people, including Kim Darroch, former British ambassador to Washington, saying over the weekend, Putin is probably bluffing. But, you're a prime minister. You are, in theory, putting your entire country and population at risk of escalating the war. So you've got to do it, it's not just us. We've got to do it in concert with other people. Yeah. And if we're the ones leading the pack, then that's fine. But you can't just go it alone. You need to have the other people with you.
Peter, Adam Bolton on this programme a little while ago suggested that actually these defence secretaries and Boris Johnson are probably following the mood of Keir Starmer's government anyway. It is the US that is an outlier here. And so with that in mind, I wonder what Keir Starmer is weighing up. Isn't this an opportunity for him to be the strong man, to get in the face of Putin and to make a statement that way?
I mean, he could, but I'm with Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor in America, on a more dovish side of this. There has to be an end game. Mark Urban's piece is fascinating and points towards exactly what Joe says about an exhausted Russia, a very cautious and annoyed West, by which I really am talking, I suppose, about America. They are a superpower. They are the ones that could be the game changer here. Whether storm shadows are used or not, I don't think really is the issue here particularly. We've seen Ukraine changing its approach. It has incursions into Russia itself. That, to me, isn't defensive. If one of these missiles goes wrong and goes into a civilian area or hits a civilian target rather than a military target, what do we expect Russia to do? And then we're into the spectre, perhaps not the actuality, but the spectre of nuclear confrontation, which nobody wants. I do think Putin is bluffing. He's bluffed on numerous occasions. Numerous red lines have been crossed, and he's done very little about it. But at the same time, I'm kind of with Jake Sullivan, actually. I'm kind of with the American line here in terms of saying there's got to be a better way. Why just continue to ramp this up, and why blindly say that Zelensky is right about everything? Zelensky is not the risen messiah. Ukraine is a very corrupt country, and we need to not be apologists for Putin, who's an evil, murderous dictator, but to see this with our critical faculties, rather than simply saying blindly, Ukraine good, Russia bad.
That's interesting, that. I do wonder then what the way to get round this is, because, some of the comments from the defence secretaries today in the paper accuse Sir Keir Starmer of, would make Britain appeasers of the Kremlin, says Ben Wallace, if they didn't act now.
That's just not true.
Gavin William, a dereliction of duty.
No, I completely disagree with that. And actually, if you look at what's going to happen at the UN General Assembly, which is in, this week, we're going to be in a situation where Zelensky is going to put his case forward. The UN together, collectively, is going to make a decision on this in terms of whether they are in agreement with him. America will do that as well. Zelensky, of course, wants this to happen as soon as possible, and I get that. I understand his reasoning on that. But the Americans are saying, let's just take a beat, work this out, and see what we want to do. And I think that is a very sensible state of affairs and plan of attack.
Many of the vulnerable or Russian targets which are vulnerable to things like the ACMS missile, the American missile, and Storm Shadow have already been moved deeper inside Russia. So it's not going to be a golden bullet. How it could help Ukraine is it could act incrementally to the pressure building up on Russia, both militarily and economically.
We're getting closer and closer to the moment when President Biden will say yes to Ukraine's plea to be able to use American long-range missiles to hit Russian targets. And then what? The hope is it will help Ukraine fight off the Russians. The fear is that it will just escalate the war further. The nightmare is it means the war breaks out of the borders of Ukraine and Russia and ends up hitting Europe. And it may be very unlikely, but the unthinkable is that this triggers a nuclear confrontation. Let's assess all this with Anthony Lloyd, special correspondent for The Times, who's been to Ukraine many times. Anthony, good morning to you.
Stig, good morning.
Is it very straightforward, that longer range missiles will help Ukraine, but what will it help them do when it comes to this war coming to some form of conclusion?
Stig, that's an excellent question. Yes, it will help Ukraine, but it's not going to be a golden bullet. It's not going to be one of those fulcrum moments in a conflict that a mere weapon system alone, which will allow Ukraine to strike deeper in the case of Storm Shadow, for example. If the Ukrainians are authorized to use Storm Shadow deeper into Russia, it gives them a range of, I think, about 155 miles into Russia. It can hit some major logistics bases, some of the main locations where Fab glide missiles are being manufactured, but it's not actually going to turn around the conflict as a single act of allowing a weapon system to be used. And in fairness, many of the vulnerable or Russian targets which are vulnerable to things like the ACMS missile, the American missile, and Storm Shadow have already been moved deeper inside Russia. So it's not going to be a golden bullet. How it could help Ukraine is it could act incrementally to the pressure building up on Russia, both militarily and economically. However, if you consider whether or not Russia can be defeated one day through the advancement of further weapons being given to Ukraine, I think there's three likely scenarios which you have to consider. And I think, first of all, the overall defeat of Russia in a way that repels all its forces from Ukraine and Crimea is extremely unlikely and possibly impossible. Possibly impossible, actually.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. That could there, if I mean, maybe the point is having this conversation, but we've endlessly spoken to various people from former NATO people from the Baltic states, people all over the place, saying to us, if you'd done this in year one, in day one, if you'd said to Ukraine, here are the jets, here are the fighters, here are the missiles, here are all the things necessary to fight a modern war, actually it'd be very, very different. But what's ended up is there's been this gradualist approach by America, particularly also Germany, and we've ended up, 2.5 years in, whatever it now is, only now getting equipment that could have some effect, but it won't be enough. Do you think if this had been done quicker, there would have been a different discussion to have?
Possibly, but I don't think it was ever going to be done quicker. I don't think there was any way that when Russia invaded Ukraine, you would get a united, coherent Western world just, escalating immediately the war with masses of weapons. It was never going to happen. So I think it is a slightly bogus or hypothetical kind of discussion to have. But I think the key thing is here, Stig, to my mind, the key thing is, can Putin's mind be changed over Ukraine? Because Russia is not going to be defeated outright militarily in a way whereby Ukrainian forces drive all Russian forces from Donetsk, from Luhansk and Crimea, including the Russian Black Sea Fleet headquarters at Sevastopol. That's not going to happen. No reasonable person thinks that's going to happen. So the next scenario, can Russia be made to pay enough in terms of men, munitions and money in a way that changes Putin's mind? So he actually thinks, I'll have to sit down and do a reasonable negotiated settlement here, one that's trusted by Ukraine. Well, personally, I think that's pretty unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's pretty unlikely. And then there's the third option, which is basically to keep up as much pressure as reasonably possible against Russia without triggering World War III in a way that accepts this war, unpleasant, deeply unpleasant and costly though it is going to go on for a long time until eventually Putin is either replaced or he hands over power or he dies. There's no quick fit solution to
or the Ukrainians give up territory. That's the other elephant in the room there, because Putin's not going anywhere. The person who replaces him might be worse, more belligerent than him, and therefore Ukraine might have to give up.
That's very true. But one thing I think is almost certain, unless we get a complete rogue card coming into the war, and war's ruled, as I always say, by the dynamic of chaos. So you can never quite predict how this is. This is going to end with a negotiated settlement. It's not going to end with an outright military victory. for either side. I don't think any reasonable person thinks that. So someday you're going to get both sides, however worn down they might be, sitting down for a negotiated settlement. And that negotiated settlement will almost inevitably involve the loss of some territory from Ukraine. And bear in mind, it's held great areas of Donetsk and Luhansk and certainly Crimea since 2014. And there's a population of about 2.7 million people in Donetsk and Luhansk who are either elected to stay in Russian areas or have thought their choices have necessitated them to stay. That's very complicated, but it will end this war with a negotiated settlement and some sort of secession of some territory.
Well, I'm sure that's exactly right. Anthony, I also see from the Times it's your birthday today, so thank you for speaking to us on your birthday. Happy birthday. You don't look 58, you look better for it and all that.
Just as well the camera's off, Steve.
Yeah, I know that this lifestyle suits you. Anthony, great to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.